Okay, part two to my Iraq lecture. Um, and where we left off, the US had just defeated Iraq in the Persian Gulf War of 1991. And they had put a bunch of very strict conditions or penalties on Iraq. They had economic sanctions. They had a no-fly zone. Throughout the 90s, every once in a while, Clinton would bomb them because they broke some of the terms of the treaty after the Persian Gulf War. And then September 11th happens. Okay, a day that will go down in infamy, already is, next to Pearl Harbor, as some of the worst attacks our country has ever faced. We'll never forget that day. I was 26 in my second year of teaching at Verge, and Virgin Middle. And immediately following the crisis or the attacks, the U.S. Was really scared. Okay? There's a lot of fear in the country. People didn't really get what had happened. Terrorism wasn't on anyone's radar. I mean, maybe it was on our military's radar, that specialists and defense experts, these people had been talking about terrorism and written notes to Bush and warned him of an imminent attack on the US. But for the average American, this was not something that I remember in the 90s or the early 2000s ever hearing anyone talk about. And people were really nervous and scared. Okay, I remember I had one buddy in the 90s named Gino, and he would be like, what if someone flew an airplane into a building? And I was like, no. The military would have jets in the air and they would shoot it down. Our military is so tough. I've seen all the movies. It didn't happen. Although there are questions about what happened to that fourth plane. I don't know. But maybe, they think it was the passengers who brought it down, not the jet, the military jet. Okay. So one of the things that happens right after September 11th is these 4 envelopes get mailed to Congress and to like the news, okay, the media. And they have this biological weapon called anthrax in them. And it's a powder, a white powder. And if you breathe it in, it kills you. It's incredibly deadly. And in fact, like, people were dying, mail carriers and people who worked mail facilities, and the person who opened the envelope. A lot of people died in these anthrax attacks, and it was scary, and people were getting even more scared in America. It happened right after, weeks, months after the September 11th attacks. The US does go to war with Afghanistan. They easily defeat Afghanistan. But many people in the US wanted more to be done to make sure that something like that could never happen again. And one of the places that our President Bush looked was in Iraq. He says Iraq used to have a chemical weapon factory. Iraq, they used them against Iran. Iraq was trying to make biological weapons in 1990 after the war in the Persian Gulf. The UN sent weapons inspectors in, and they saw that, they were trying to make chemical and biological weapons. They were trying to make a nuclear bomb. And they watched them dismantle their chemical weapons and biological weapons and nuclear weapon factories. But President Bush and some defense experts believed that they were still trying, that Iraq was still trying to make chemical weapons, and that they actually had mobile chemical weapons laboratories, that they were trying to make biological weapons like anthrax, and that they were trying to make a nuclear bomb. And President Bush went to the UN. This is here, him speaking in front of the UN. And he said, I would like you guys to support me once again. Now, the UN had supported the Persian Gulf War. The UN had supported the war in Afghanistan. And he says, we have to get weapons inspectors in Iraq and make sure that they're not making chemical weapons and giving them to terrorists, or biological weapons like anthrax. No one really knew. I don't know if anyone knows who made those weapons, those anthrax attacks. Or even nuclear weapons was a fear. And well, the UN decided, yeah, let's get some weapons inspectors in there. Let's find out if they have completely dismantled their weapons programs. And they sent in weapons inspectors. The Iraqis let them in, and they didn't find any chemical weapons in the laboratories that used to have them. They didn't find any proof of nuclear weapons or biological weapons. But still, Bush was insistent that we had to go in there and find out for ourselves. He actually sent Defense Secretary Colin Powell in to the UN with anthrax. That anthrax right there in his hand could kill thousands of people if it was breathed in. And the UN still said, no, we're not going to support a war in Iraq on a hunch or on top secret military experts' opinion that they still are making chemical and biological weapons, and that they're even looking to get, aluminum tubes for nuclear weapons. No, the UN said, not this time, America. We know you're scared. What happened September 11th? No, war with Iraq. But the US said yes. Now, keep in mind that this area is oil rich. And a lot of people said America's going to war with Iraq to get their hands on Iraqi oil. People said America's going to war with Iraq because President Bush doesn't like Saddam Hussein. Here's the Iraq leader, Saddam Hussein. Apparently Saddam Hussein had put a hit out on President Bush's dad or something after the first Iraq war. I don't know. No one really knows. President Bush says he went there to try and make sure they didn't have chemical weapons. And he launches a war against Iraq. Okay, since we didn't have the UN support, the US says we're going to put together our own coalition, and we'll go in there and we'll find those chemical weapons. We'll get rid of Saddam Hussein. Britain, maybe our best buddy, was there. Australia, I think Spain and Italy, but not Germany, not France, certainly not Russia or China. We're all, well, not Germany, but France, and Russia and China are permanent members of the UN Security Council. They said no. Germany is very powerful, European country. The US does it anyways. And the US was easily able to take out Iraq and replace the leadership. Saddam Hussein, who we just saw was captured and killed. They put together a court, they gave him a little trial, and they hung him dead. It was on the internet for a while. It's gross. And some mistakes were made by the US in this war planning. First off, there was no draft for this war or the Afghanistan war. And the US went in light. In Afghanistan, the US went in with like 10,000 soldiers. In Iraq, they went in with less than 100,000. Remember, in World War II, they went in with like 2 million soldiers plus. World War I, same thing, 1 million plus. And after Saddam Hussein was captured, the police, the military was disbanded. Maybe this was a mistake. Some would say if they had kept the military, their jobs, and kept paying them, there would have been security, but there wasn't. And in Iraq, the country kind of went crazy for a while there. And there was no police, there was no military, people were robbing and stealing and killing. And the US was responsible for security after the war. That's what happens when you destroy a country's security apparatus. You're responsible were keeping it safe afterwards, at least a while. I mean, gosh, you guys, I'm not sure if you know this, but the US still has 50,000 plus troops in Germany, in Japan, in Korea. I have a great buddy who served in Korea in the 2000s, maybe the 90s. That's what the US does. After the US goes to war, we learned this in the Treaty of Versailles, where you help the country up, you help rebuild it. The US didn't do that in Iraq. We didn't follow our lessons that we learned after World War I, and Iraq became a chaotic place. Many Iraqis launched terrorist attacks against the US. They did not like the US coming in and taking over. US troops were being killed, not as much at first, but more as the US occupied Iraq and tried to control Iraq with a small amount of soldiers. We started, a guy named Alawi became president, tried to rebuild their police, rebuild their army. We gave them weapons, we gave them money, and it just didn't work. They weren't dedicated. As these terrorist attacks continued, American public started souring on the war. They started saying, that was a failure. This is another Vietnam. And right now, I want to take a look at this chart. This is a death chart of US soldiers. And what you'll notice is that here at the beginning of the war in the first year, there were many less deaths than as the war moved on. This is of US soldiers dying in action, not taking over the country, but maintaining the peace. This is a map of civilian casualties in Iraq for the 10 years following the war. Look, the worst time was in 2006. 3 years after the war had already been over. There were anti-war protests in America. And still to this day, people wonder, did we win that war? Is this a Vietnam? Part 2? Part 3? I don't know. President Bush in 2008, after President Obama had been elected, decided he was going to pull troops out. And in December of that year, after the election, he signed a document saying we're going to pull our troops out of Iraq. In 2010, President Obama continued this. He allowed it to happen. He could have stopped that. And he pulled the majority of the troops out of Iraq. He left a small group in there just to kind of advise, an advisory panel. And he thought that there was enough army. He and Bush planned to protect Iraq. It was not the case. There were 4,000 American soldiers who died, 30,000 suffered major injuries, missing arms and legs, blown up by terrorist attacks. They had these IEDs, they would plant roadside bombs. And as the Americans on patrol would go around, their explosion would happen. Americans had like body armor, but their arms and legs would be killed, be destroyed, missing. On top of that, it's an estimated 150,000 to 1 million, maybe, Iraqi civilians who were killed. Let's take a look at this. How many Iraqi civilians or military, but they didn't even have much, their military didn't fight. How many Iraqis were killed? Well, 50,000 is some of the low numbers, 80,000. 150,000 for the WHO, that's a pretty reliable source. 400,000? 400 to 700,000, a million. I don't know. No one really knows. It was not good. In 2014, a terrorist group named ISIS comes in and starts taking over parts of Iraq. They take over the US built Iraqi military. So we gave them all the weapons, and when the ISIS terrorists came in, they were connected to Al-Qaeda, they were connected to Osama bin Laden's group. The Iraqi military just ran and left all the weapons, and now these people took over this part of Iraq, including the second biggest city, Mosul, I think there was 2 million people in that city. That's a huge city. And they got all the US weapons. They took over also huge chunks of Syria, and Syria was having its own civil war. And in January of 2015, Iraq, huge parts of Iraq had been taken over by terrorists. Not Baghdad, but huge parts of Iraq. And Obama had to send a ton of troops back in there. They started chipping away, taking land back. It won't be until 2018 that Al-Qaeda, that ISIS, only controls these small parts, the dark brown. In Syria, they had been completely kicked out of Iraq by then. Trump was president by then. It was no longer Obama. Yes. And at the end of the day, they never found chemical or biological weapons in Iraq. Today, Iraq is closer to Iran than they are to the US, and Iran is building nuclear weapons against the US orders. Did we lose that war? It was too close historically to tell. We'll find out in 10 to 20 years. This was not good. This was not good at all.